When we start schooling at a primary or elementary level, the emphasis is of course on socialisation and learning. And there's of course a sense of fun and joy that comes out of it all. But there's a very clear shift about when we move beyond those days, and I want to know why that's the case. Ticker Ed starts right now.
Ticker Ed, in association with Enquiry Tracker, empowering schools to manage and grow inquiries and online enrolments.
Hello and welcome back to Ticker Ed, the show where we unpack and examine the way we teach, listen and learn from primary education through to university and beyond. Ticker Ed is of course backed by the team at Enquiry Tracker, who are the all-in-one solution for schools to easily manage their future families. Of course, whilst Enquiry Tracker is the presenting sponsor of today's program, all of the opinions and statements expressed in the following segment, they are our own. And joining me now is my regular co-host and founder of Enquiry Tracker, Greg Campitelli, along with today's topic, which is an interesting one as usual. Greg, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
And we're talking about the way learning and teaching changes as we shift through education levels. And Greg, there's such a major difference between how teachers teach at the primary level
Sure.
and how slash elementary and how they go into high school.
Well, it rapidly evolves. Let's just start at the early learning centres where it all begins. It's very much that the students are in tiny small groups at an early learning centre. It's all about play-based learning. There's a lot of fun. The teaching is all about welcoming, inclusivity, fun. Gets into primary schools, of course, and elementary schools. They're bigger, but they're still often pretty small still, where most people know each other.
Yeah.
The children start to learn subject-based work,
Yes.
but there's one class teacher for the whole year, pretty much effectively teaching them. So the relationship between the student and the teacher can very close and very intimate. At the secondary and high school level, firstly, the schools are much bigger, and they're physically bigger. There's more staff, there's more students, and suddenly those students are now a small fish in a very big pond.
Correct.
And there's a range of different classes that they're experiencing with different teachers on different days. So suddenly the learning shifts to subject-based learning.
I remember getting my calendar for the first time in high school and absolutely just freaking out.
Absolutely. Then we move into university, and the pond gets much bigger. And we're talking about universities that can be the size of towns.
Yeah.
There are 43 universities in Australia for a population of 25 million people. But interestingly, in America, the University of Central Florida has one of the largest populations with, get this, 62,000 undergraduates. So it's not surprising that the relationship suddenly becomes a bit more distant and siloed. And at uni, it's 100% subject-based teaching. That's it.
Interesting. So Greg, what does this mean for teaching styles at these various levels, do you think?
Well, I think perhaps at the primary and elementary level, it's firstly that one class teacher for the whole year, pretty much. But the classroom is physically very vibrant and full of colour and rich learning, and teaching pretty much occurs inside that classroom for the whole day. The children are all together all the time. The children are generally learning in small groups, and it's a very holistic approach to that learning. Often that teacher can be almost acting like a surrogate parent.
Correct.
They're seeing them all the time, just pretty much mostly after their own family. What's really interesting, if you step into an elementary or primary school in Tokyo, London, Paris, Sydney or New York, they're pretty much the same.
Right.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden then you're sitting in rows, heads down, books down, pens up. When we look at high school, secondary, which is of course a radical shift. Why is that the case?
It changes overnight. Suddenly you're in one kind of environment, suddenly lined up in rows as you said, with the teacher up the front. And you've hinted on it, there's the teaching shifts to that more content and information-based learning. There's one teacher often teaching one or two specialist subjects across a range of different classes and year levels. That shift in teaching moves from that beautiful, fun way of learning to a far more structured. The timetable is king.
Yeah.
You mentioned it before, it goes crazy.
I still get stressed about it.
And it becomes a real high stakes game with
Correct.
everything starting to move towards exam and preparation for university entrance. And at the university, learning and fun of learning almost evaporates. They offer a twin-based learning system, large lectures, and small prac-based tutorials. And it's what really is interesting for me is at the university level, they are content expert specialists. You do not have to be qualified as a teacher to teach in universities.
Interesting. Interesting stuff. All right, well, that seems like a great time to welcome our guest to get a little bit more insight on all of this, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
And we've got Peter Cutrona, who is the president of the Australian Catholic Primary Principals Association and principal of St Simon Peter Catholic Primary School in Western Australia. Hopefully, he can share some insight with us. How are you, my friend?
I'm travelling pretty well, thank you.
We're obviously trying to make sense of all this, so hopefully you can help us out. But Peter, what special teaching qualities do primary and elementary teachers embody? And why do you think they're so good, based on what you've seen?
Look, I think all good teachers, regardless of what year level they teach, are able to develop those great relationships that Greg was just talking about. They understand what motivates the kids and how they learn best. Look, primary and elementary teachers have the advantage of spending the significant amount of time each day with their students, and the good one use that time really well to develop a great understanding of the needs of their students. And in the end, they use that time during the day to work with the children with what they need, regardless of what may actually be planned. They're able to pivot, I suppose, to meet those particular needs. When you're in a content-based environment, you've got to teach the content. Primary, they spend the time to know those kids really well, and in turn, that actually allows that real connection with their students and their learning to actually occur. And I guess the really important part of all learning is to provide that appropriate feedback. When you're in a specific amount of time, you just can't do that.
It's really interesting, Peter. What do you think gets lost in translation, in that transition from elementary style teaching into that kind of high school or secondary kind of teaching? What gets lost?
Well, again, when you're working within a short period of time and then you move on to another group of students, you really don't get to know, I guess, the strengths and areas of further growth quite deeply with each individual student. When you're working with 25 or 30 kids throughout the entire day, you're able to actually work those things out and then actually work on them. So when you move to a subject-based timetable, you have that defined time to deliver the curriculum, and then you start again with another cohort of students. And what's previously happened doesn't actually impact within that teaching space. And that could be really significant on a student's learning. They may have come in, something quite distressful may have actually happened for that young child, and the teacher's actually able to work with that. When you walk into a subject-based timetable, you don't know what's actually happened beforehand. And I think that's the key thing.
Peter, why is this such a profound change occurring? I mean, this is a global phenomenon, sort of as Greg highlighted earlier.
Look, I think Greg did point out to it that it doesn't matter where you are around the world. Schools are similar in how we deliver curriculum content and how we teach. Time and resources are part of that global predicament for schools and teachers, regardless of whether they're primary, secondary, or at university. And I guess one of the big problems that we actually have is that when we move too far away from what's normally has occurred, and I guess COVID has forced us to be in that space, it gets scrutinised a lot more than what would normally actually happen. So when we're trying to make changes, we have to do it in a gradual and small step approach. When we try to do things too quickly and in a very large sort of a way and move from the norm, then it gets scrutinised. It then makes it more difficult to actually make the changes that you actually need. So for us to move in a primary context to a secondary based model would actually be quite unusual and probably would get, as I say, scrutinised to a level that may actually defeat the purpose of what you're trying to do.
So let the Year 12s have nap time.
Quite possibly.
As an association, Peter, there must be things that perhaps primary could share with secondary in terms of techniques, or what would you like to see secondary teachers adopt more into their perhaps teaching portfolio?
Look, I think everyone, regardless of what they teach, can learn from those around them. And whether it's primary or secondary, I think we hardly ever get the opportunity to spend time in a colleague's classroom on a regular basis, as we just don't have the time resources to make this happen without taking from another space. So I guess if we could imagine a classroom, whether it's in a primary or secondary space, where we could actually spend time observing somebody else and how they teach, how they deliver their lessons, and then the opportunity to actually debrief with them, and for us to go into a secondary context and see how they do it, and for a primary person to have a secondary person do the same, I think that's something that's doable. And I think it probably would have a great effect on what we do and what a secondary person might do. They might look at things a little bit differently.
Absolutely. Peter, thank you so much for joining us on the program and highlighting a little bit more about this space. It's certainly an interesting one to consider.
No worries. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Greg.
And Greg, as always, wonderful to discuss these little nuanced pieces of the education industry. What are your top tips for today?
Well, firstly, that the main goal and outcome of education is always learning and fun. But learning can be fun and enjoyable at any level. I love that last point by Peter. The different levels can learn from one another. So why not encourage formal teacher exchange programs between your high school and your elementary school, your secondary school and your primary school to really learn from each other?
Absolutely. Well said by you, my friend. And thank you so much for bringing Peter to the program and always bringing great guests and great content.
Great. Another great show.
Wonderful stuff from you, Greg, as always. A thought-provoking show today and presented by the team at Enquiry Tracker. And if you'd like to learn more about how your school can make use of this amazing admission software, please head over to the team at enquirytracker.net. I've been Mike Loader and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Be well.